Okay, let's get going. So today, very excited today to have you all with us, and particularly excited and honored to have my co-hosts with me today, Mike Goodyear, Apex Learning, and Tricia Blum of Charter School Capital. So without further ado, let me just say, as the CEO of Charter School Capital, we've been funding schools now for, I guess, 13 years, more than 700 charter schools, over $2 billion invested in charters across the country, supporting now more than 1.25 million kids. And we're excited to bring you this content today, as we always are. I want to introduce to you Mike Goodyear and Tricia. And Mike, if you could provide everybody a little bit of your background, so people understand what we're touching on today.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stuart. Yes, I'm with Apex Learning as an implementation success manager. So I go out into all of our schools and partners and implement our solutions, work on professional development, work with clients on success factors as well to make their implementation successful and help all kids out there. So that's my role. Glad to be here.
And Apex focuses, Mike, and those implementation success you look at and help people with is built largely around remote learning. Is that correct?
Yeah, almost entirely around remote learning and virtual learning, and just different models that solutions can apply to very well.
That's great. Thanks. And Tricia, can you give people a little background on you so I don't have to brag about you myself?
Thank you, Stuart. That's nice to hear. Welcome, everyone. My name is Tricia Blum. I'm Vice President of Business Services at Charter School Capital. I worked on the operator side of charter schools from 2013 till 2017, when I moved over and became a person that helps schools plan for their success at Charter School Capital. So any of the business challenges or questions that schools have, I work with schools to do that. And prior to all of this, I was a transactional lawyer.
So between transactional lawyer and your job today, you were a senior executive or CEO at large charter school organizations, two different ones in California. So you understand a little bit of what people are dealing with, even though this is the first time for all of us with this type of situation. So today, thank you both for joining us. It's, as I said, very exciting for me to have this level of expertise available. One is maintaining and building financial stability of your school. Second, Mike will walk us through understanding remote learning and best practices. Tricia is going to talk about building staff board and authorizer support throughout this process, and then we'll close out with a few other considerations and best practices to keep things on track as you run through the challenges that we are expecting schools to face over the coming months and years. So, financial stability. What kind of situation are we dealing with today? Yesterday's headline, tomorrow's challenge. People close to the financial challenges that are coming are really concerned about major financial upheaval. And a lot of us are reading about that in the news, but don't really know all of what that means, and nobody really can predict what it means. One of the things we're going to touch on here and walk through is thinking about some of the implications coming. And there are, as part of the consideration of articles and some of the speaking engagements occurring in Congress right now at a national level and at state and local levels across the country, a number of things to think about. One is there are new costs that schools never had before at a limited level, things like just increase in cleaning and janitorial services. At other ends of the spectrum, just the inconsistency of and dealing with some of the cost of health risks, disease, and managing the new challenges in a new and flexible way. Generally, people view the schools as not prepared for what's coming in terms of the strain on public finances and the reduction in tax dollars coming through. And since in many cases, the financial leaders who and school leaders who were running programs more than a decade ago with the Great Recession are no longer in a position. So people leading organizations today, in many cases, haven't dealt with this kind of crisis. And the crisis we're dealing with, this morning's New York Times mentions that the peak unemployment levels week by week, they track them for the last couple of decades. The filings last week in terms of financial impact and unemployment were more than 5x the highest unemployment filing week at any point during the recession back in 2008. So I think people are not really ready for what's coming, despite the packages being run through Congress in terms of stimulus and stabilization financial packages. The impact of that is that local sources of money, such as sales tax and the like, are going to suffer during a significant economic downturn, although we don't know how significant it will be, but that's going to take some bite out of the revenue streams available to fund public schools everywhere. So what does that really mean? What's coming? Well, we can look back as an example of what happened during the last recession and what we're seeing right now. In the near term, state, local, and federal governments have all committed to keep funding schools through this fiscal year at the previously expected levels and budgeted levels. And part of the reason for that is state, local agencies, the federal government all still have cash from the tax. Sorry about that. You guys would probably like to hear me. Trisha and Mike, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So
Yes.
in the near term, things will continue as expected, but still you need to continue to track what's going on in local changes and laws. So state by state over the last few weeks, at this point, nearly every state has come forward and said they're going to continue funding at previously expected levels. They've made changes in laws that allow for flexibility for charters, that in some states you can't use remote learning necessarily unless your charter specifically says. Most states have modified those and passed or are in the process of passing laws that allow that and encourage that. Things that you need to do on your end as a school leader are to track your local laws and those things required by your charter authorizer. We have a list running right now. At the end of this, we have links to the various state laws, but you can contact Charter School Capital and we can provide you access to reports or send those out to your advisors. You can also track local advisors and attorneys in the area, but keep track of what's going on from a local legal standpoint. One thing that has not really been addressed in most states so far are some specific funding areas that are still unresolved, though we would expect funding to continue for this fiscal year, and that's things like special ed or some local and state governments have specific requirements and funding for homeless children. Also, some funding is contingent upon schools continuing to provide free and reduced lunch meals for kids that qualify for that. And so with all of this, stay aware of local changes in your laws and see how your charter complies. And throughout this process, make sure you're documenting what you're doing in the near term to ensure that future revenues remain fully intact later, as some states have come through and said, we're going to keep funding you, but later you'll have to have shown that you tried to teach kids and delivered some remote learning. So that's something to keep in mind as you go through things. But in the very near term, funds should keep flowing as they were previously intended through this fiscal year. The big uncertainty is around next fiscal year, given that tax revenues are expected to be a lot lower. If you think about the filings, federal unemployment filings that I've talked about, the local businesses shutting down, and generally economic flows kind of stopping, state and local governments have a lot fewer tax dollars to spread around, which will pressure state budgets going forward. In the last recession, the way this was managed by states is with relatively small cuts in per student funding. Though some states had cuts, they were relative to the reduction in overall funding levels or tax revenues levels. The education funding was reduced much less. But many states dealt with and managed the reduction in tax revenues through deferrals. And we would expect to see a combination of both things going forward. Again, heavy use of deferrals with some cuts. And so another area to consider in terms of revenue reductions next fiscal year are likely significant declines in charitable giving, which we experienced during the last recession. So given that these things are coming, as a school leader, beginning to think about how to offset the impacts of those potential reductions in per student funding and potential delays is important. And then focus on the things you can control. All the things I really talked about so far are things that are beyond the control of individual leaders. Certainly you can influence them by contacting your local representatives, but there's less money to spread around, and school funding is going to be affected in some way, albeit perhaps in a delay rather than a reduction. So what are the things you can control? The first is to maintain that stability of your revenue streams. And there it's focusing on your enrollment. The students you serve and your mission to deliver against enhanced and high quality education for kids really is paid for by that enrollment. And so maintaining close contact with, at least from a technology standpoint, and communication standpoint with students and families is critically important to ensure the stable enrollment for your school. And then as you go through, make a checklist of all the revenue streams that you have and try to maintain them with the expectation, as previously mentioned, that charitable giving will likely drop and per student revenues will be delayed or reduced. The second thing is to understand state and local requirements. Finding out what states are paying for and what they're not is important. Make sure you understand what you're permitted or required to do. So as mentioned, in some states, they're going to continue to fund, but then next year there will be some audit. You have to show that you tried to deliver remote learning in some cases, or that you did or tracked it or what have you. And so be prepared for that. Even though many people don't know how that will be supported or whether that will be required, tracking and documenting what you do is really important. As you move through understanding your local requirements and tracking activities to ensure that you can help maintain your future revenue streams, you also need to manage your cost side, or at least cash flows, managing vendors and payments. Your trusted vendors are really important. They deliver services that you require, whether it's special ed experts and advisors who provide IEPs, or local food services vendors, your landlord if you're engaged in a lease situation, or debt service, banking relationships, etc. Maintain contact with those vendors. They're also dealing with their own challenges. So vendors will understand and do understand the situation schools are in and their clients are in. However, we should also be understanding the situations they're in. So be prepared to be flexible, and also find vendors who can be flexible with you. And then try to manage all outgoing payments, avoiding kind of overpaying at this point or prepaying things. There's no reason to do that. One of the things you really need to do is to build cash and access cash. So reserving your cash for a likely need for it the early and throughout next fiscal year is important. So try to find ways to build cash reserves And one way to do that is make sure you have access to financing. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. So why is maintaining enrollment so vital? Regardless of what happens in per student funding, the lifeblood of a school is the mission that you serve, teaching kids, and you're paid for that, obviously. So here's an example that runs through a school with 500 students at $10,000 per student, or $5 million in annual revenue. And it shows how important maintaining your enrollment is. One thing I want to say is, at a macro level, it's likely that enrollment is going to not be pressured to decline, right? It'll probably be, on the other end, there will be attendance issues while people still need to find schooling. And in an economic crisis, private schools are likely to have people shift where they had to provide or pay tuition to public schools. And charters tend to get a bigger uptick of that than anybody else during this type of period. But here's an example where a school loses 10% of its student enrollment. So at the chart on the left, you can see fiscal year 20 is what we're talking about this fiscal year. Fiscal year 21, next fiscal year, when we expect to face some of these challenges. So if you had a 10% decline in enrollment of the 500 kids, your revenue would drop, as you see with the kind of blue box there. Revenue drops from $5 million to $4.5 million. And then you have to make a decision about whether you're reducing costs in line with that. So if you have a 10% decrease in student enrollment, you could reduce your teaching salaries, curriculum costs, et cetera. Those things that are variable, you could reduce also by 10%. And that would save you $350,000. And this is an example school with national averages that we've used. You go to the middle chart, net surplus. In fiscal 20, you were running, let's say, a break-even budget. But in fiscal 21, with the drop in attendance of 50 kids, you would actually show a loss that year of $150,000 if you reduced your variable costs by 10%. If you didn't, that dashed line down below that shows $500,000 is the loss you would take in fiscal 21. So in any case, if you just reduced by the variable cost with your decline in enrollment from break even, you would lose $150,000 if you manage your costs aggressively, but $500,000 if you chose to keep the same cost structure. That would leave you with the chart on the right, which is managing your cash. So let's say in a year where you were break even this year, you started and ended with $100,000 cash balance at the end of any month or at the end of the year. If you manage that through next year, reducing your variable cost, you would still end up under or not have enough cash to finish the year by $50,000. If you did not manage your costs and you kept the same teaching and staffing levels, you would actually be $400,000 short, which, if you think about it, given the cash requirements to fund a school throughout the year, that would mean really you'd make it through about 4 months of next fiscal year before you ran out of cash. So what does all that mean? Well, and I'm sorry to keep throwing these financial graphs. So one option you have, school can't run without cash, right, to pay vendors, teachers, et cetera. So one thing to do is to manage all those costs, as we've showed on the last page. You have to eliminate the costs for the revenue that went away if your enrollment declined. A second way to manage these risks around funding levels or enrollment is to finance. And the chart on the left, we have the same example we had previously, but now we have a third bar showing with financing. And we've used an extremely high cost of financing here to display that it's about having the money. It's not about the cost of that money, and I'll explain as we go along. So in this case, we assumed a school gets financing of $1 million for its $5 million budget. And it pays a 20% annualized rate, which is extremely high for any schools, and not likely what you'll have to deal with, but we're trying to use an example here that shows how valuable having funds are and how much it costs. That would cost a school $200,000, as you can see in that chart on the right. If you add those financing to the chart we had previously, you now have not a $150,000 loss with managing costs, or a $500,000 loss without expense reduction, but instead a $350,000 loss, or $700,000 loss without reducing costs anywhere else. And that leads you to this chart on the right. What does the cash look like? And there, in the previous example with no financing, you ran out of money somewhere during the year with a $50,000 loss or $400,000 loss if you don't manage your costs. Or with financing, you can see you actually have $850,000 still available at year end when the cost management scenario, or you could actually not cut costs at all throughout all of fiscal 21, and you would still have more than $140,000 of cash left over at the end of the year. And all of this is with 20% financing. If it was a 10% annual percentage rate, that would cost you $100,000, not $200,000. Or if it was a 5% rate, it would cost $50,000 instead of $200,000. The main point being the cost of that financing, even at a rate like 20%, would still leave the school in a very strong cash position throughout the year, if you can arrange it. Okay, so what's going on in the financial markets right now? First, we've all been hearing about the Fed dropping rates, and that blue line on the chart on the left is 1 month Treasury yields, or what's going on with the Fed rates. And you can see back from January, the weekly rates, where Treasuries were at 1.5%, and you can see today on the right side of the chart in March, those rates have dropped to essentially zero. Longer term rates are tracked by that gold line, which are municipal bond yields. And you can see there that's what has happened is those rates have spiked actually to the high side and are beginning to normalize. What's going on here is that while base rates are dropping, things like the prime rate, LIBOR, treasuries, credit spreads, or the risk that funding sources are seeing in the market are widening and rising. Overall rates for charters will be the same or likely higher actually in the near term. But having funds available, if you have a surplus, great. If you can get financing, arrange it so you can weather the storm coming. And as we face this financial crisis, banks are going to shy away from anyone they view as somewhat risky. Bond issuances in the market, you can see that disruption. The rise in rates indicates that many bond issuances may be delayed if you were planning on that, or as the markets are disrupted. And so focus on dealing with near-term financing, which or as opposed to locking in long-term financing right now, can be helpful. Okay, what does all that mean? Given that the mission is to educate kids, enrollment is the key to driving financial stability of your school. Leaders should be preparing for a drop or delay in funding levels next fiscal year due to changes in government funding levels and the tax rolls, and or declines in charitable giving. And as a school leader, you're gonna have to manage this balance between cutting costs and borrowing to build cash, which can really act like an insurance policy for you. If none of these changes happen and everything continues to flow and be great next year, then having the financing will have been a relatively little cost, even at the rates we talked about on the previous slide. $200,000 is just 1% of a school's revenue, and that gave you $1 million cash on hand So that can be a great insurance policy. And finding ways to keep kids and parents engaged as they both really need support during this time. And then beginning to leverage remote learning wherever you can is important. And to talk about that, I'm going to turn things over to Mike, who will walk through, I think, key things to think about during a remote learning period. Mike? Mike, if you're on mute, can you unmute?
Yes, that should be better. Hi, folks.
Okay.
Yeah,
we can hear you now. We can hear you now. We couldn't hear you
just
before.
saw lips before. Okay, yeah. So, you know, we came up with different steps along the way, and we're big involved with digital learning, setting up virtual schooling for our clients. So a lot of these steps are very important in terms of setting up digital learning, remote learning. Policies and procedures are really important, talking through just requirements for students. Reporting is really big with charters that I work with as well, being able to see time on task and just getting all that set up is a really important thing. There's a lot of control measures out there with different types of product, and it's important that everybody's in the know of that, so that we can set it up to make kids successful. Student counts, staff accounts come in after that. And then we're just kind of setting up some policies and procedures as well for the e-learning experience. So depending on different LMS that might be used or other integrations, that's also going to be addressed as well to deal with some efficiencies. We just set up our classrooms and we enroll students, and they're pretty much ready to go after we've done the vetting out of the curriculum, the classroom content that we want to assign to them. So there's a lot of flexibility in that, at least within our platform, and any platforms really within the industry should have that and provide that for you. And it's just the communication then comes into play of what the plan is. Orientation for students is a really big thing, explaining expectations to them, what the requirements are going to be, and what they'll need to do to complete course work for credits and for grades. So, you know, obviously, along with that, with the support that we're going to be providing to students, and I'll kind of get into that in a later slide of just the different support we can provide for students. But we should also have good monitoring, good reporting capabilities, and a lot of control that teachers have the ability to implement with programs like this for students. Next slide. So that's something we kind of set up, you know, to start a virtual school. So one of the questions that was posed is, I serve some students with online learning. How do I expand it without disruption? Good luck. No, in all seriousness, it is very, it's a challenge to get it out to all students because of factors that we can't control. You know, Stuart mentioned, even with the finances, we really try to focus on what we can control, and try to get help and assistance in areas that we can't. So the big thing really is determining the virtual learning needs your students have, considering content for those teachers out there, and evaluation of results. So one of the things that came about with the school district that my daughter goes to is we got a survey when they were, and you could tell, just being intimately involved with this, I could tell the stages that the district was in of trying to pull this all together. And I can imagine how their teachers felt and how their administrators felt. But they surveyed us and asked us that, you know, if we do have internet access, do we have a device? Do you have printers? Can your son or daughter adapt quickly to the different device or different type of computer they might use? So that's probably the first step is surveying and trying to get some some information, some data in regards to receptiveness of online learning. And then we're preparing students for these high impact practices and peer-to-peer interaction, and just taking into consideration different tools that we have, what we feel comfortable with. That's also something to think about in terms of the expanding it out without disruption. There's always going to be some students, and I'm sure you've read and have seen the equitable type of approach to this, and whether or not all students are going to have a fair shake, so to speak, at getting in and completing their work. So it's good to consider instructional programs that really already have that content, so that you don't have to curate it, that provide feedback and communication, along with assessment and some hefty reporting. There'll be a link here. Also, it's an emergency remote checklist that you can go into and take a look at. There's some other resources here, but it's just a different approach, taking a look at like a remote checklist to get this underway really quickly. Next slide. Okay, so I was glad it's set up to 60 miles an hour and not 80 miles an hour. That might be what the real speed is, but you have no remote online learning at all. So how do we do this really quickly? Different staged approach, but again, I think we're coming back to what's the best instructional strategy. And I think that, you know, a lot of districts and schools out there that I've learned are doing a multitude of remote learning, where it could be just assignments posted to a Google Classroom to pull down and print out and complete. There may be some electronic communication involved. Teachers may already have material, so why reinvent the wheel? So that's a big thing that sometimes we lose sight of, the fact that we already have a lot of material created that we can use. We may just need to put it into electronic format. One of the things that Apex Learning did is we came up with a continuity program for current clients or potential clients to get started really quickly. So, you know, the big thing is the services and what I mentioned in previous slides of the policies, the procedures, all the planning that it takes, which is very little amount of time to address that. Let's just be realistic. So, you know, companies like Apex should be able to provide you good support to make sure that implementation is successful and we're getting the most out of it with our students. So we're just going to start off by talking about the goals and determining the scope of the curriculum that we need for students, gather our resources, you know, determine an infrastructure, whether it's through an LMS or Google Classrooms or just other ways to deploy. Communication of the program guidelines is critical with a parent involvement piece. You know, we want to make sure everybody's in the know of this, and students know what the expectations are. And then it's regular best practices for your staff, your students, professional development training, just giving them time to get acclimated with all the content and the virtual schooling they might be undertaking. Next slide.
Mike, as you go through this, I think some questions are coming in for us right now about the kind of bandwidth that's needed to build in digital learning platforms. And as you're going to discuss here, I think, you know, what do you do? How do you address it if families don't have access to either high-speed internet or technology? Can you touch on those things?
Yeah, that's great. That's a good question. And we've got, you know, quite a bit of research that we've looked at where major internet providers are providing, like Spectrum, Comcast, students free Wi-Fi. Over the next couple of months, I've seen instances where there was a late charge or they hadn't paid their bill in certain examples, so they're waiving late fees to give access to the internet. So that was through Comcast. And then we have, I have another link there that's on this page right here. The 1 Million Project is actually providing a device and free internet to students at participating high schools. But I think a lot of this is research driven, and seeking out, what I see a lot is seeking out local community organizations as well, to see what assistance that they might be able to provide, looking for hot spots. We had a story of kids even during winter storms where they'll drive to the school parking lot just to use the Wi-Fi. So it's just being really creative at those offerings that we have available, and that remote checklist. So click on those links from the presentation when it's shared with you. That gives you some pretty good information, and going in and seeing how we can find free services or highly reduced services for students to be able to get online.
That sounds great.
So yeah, great amount of resources there to be able to find. Overabundant amount of resources, and you'll see those searches trending when you go to Google and type that stuff in. And the big thing is to search wisely. But there's a lot of different resources. So we're talking about instruction, free instruction, and I'm sure everybody's heard of that. Khan Academy. Immediately, I have an email in my inbox for utilizing that service. Fun Math. Okay, so we did that this morning, and we're testing out some of these different free services that are provided, which are quite a few of them as well. So, when we talk about pushing this out into school, from school into the home, take those keys to success into consideration. What is it going to look like at home? We may have a student who's used to working on an iPad at home. We're not a one-to-one device, so they're working on mom's laptop. So we have to transition. And thinking of that as teachers, as educators and leaders is really important as well, as some of that time to get acclimated with that new software, practice. That is something. All this stuff is coming at us at light speed, so it's good to take some time and get acclimated with the different types of tools that we're using. I mean, free Zoom access. You may have heard of that. Other companies are providing that to teachers so that they can teach synchronously. Teach computer organizational skills. I was talking about this and how important it was jumping in and getting the presentation done, and I just had so much information and everything, and students kind of get overwhelmed with that as well. So teaching organizational skills is a big thing. It's a life lesson that they're going to have to definitely become very proficient with. Digital manners and media literacy, and we're talking about that with students and continuing that. But like I said, the 1 Million Project provided by Sprint, I believe, is something that you may want to look into as well, providing the device and the access to students so that they can continue their learning, whatever remote method it may be. Apex has many. Go ahead.
One note for people as you talk about all of these free internet services and things like that, there's a blog post on the CSC website that under blog resources that directs people to local providers who are providing free internet resources across the country right now. And so some of that is available, and you can get it on our website, in addition to the resource links that'll be in the presentation afterwards that Mike's referring to as you go through it.
Yeah, good point. And those are updated probably hourly. The blogs will update with local internet access or just different free services that kind of get populated through that. Apex has the ability to have students complete work without being online. So thinking about other vendor or other product, this should have that version of some offline work that we can always be able to provide to students if they're in dire straits in regards to being able to get online, or just thinking about setting up locations for learning. I see a little bit of that being done, not to be confused with the testing sites that are popping up everywhere as well. So we've seen that a lot in the past for some remote learning where it's brought right to the students or in a general location. But at this point in time, obviously that's not going to occur. Next slide. And a question really about that Apex Learning attendance reporting in special education services. And this is one that it typically does come from charters that I work with, our partners, other charters. I'm thinking of one in particular in Ohio, where they are a blended school. They're a blended charter school, and they support that instructional model for its effectiveness. But the state wants that reported, instructional time, when they're at school, when they're doing things from home. They want that to be differentiated. Any product should be able to provide that to you. And Apex has our extensive reporting, which I'll show you in the next slide. Just some things that come out of our LMS that tracks attendance, various aspects of performance. The data is very robust. It should be in any system, working through efficiencies for teachers, as well as reporting up to higher bodies as we need to. So the attendance reporting, customer report services, and we provide that mostly with our charters if they need specific types of reporting. We're able to generate that for them. Apex has a lot of different pathways in terms of their courses, so that's another way we differentiate, and we can use different courses for our special education population. Everything is text to speech. Every modality of learning is represented within the curriculum, and I believe that they all need to be used. But with special ed population, a lot of scaffolds and supports along with the digital curriculum really help out student learning, and it should be engaging and active. That's what we know through research is proven, even if it's a special ed population. So the ability to customize and to flex within the system is something that we all need to look at, and definitely what Apex Learning provides.
Great.
Next slide. Yeah, I think you got to click through those. I might have put some transition into them, but you could see that with Apex, you can see every student in every course, every time they log in, how long they've been logged in, the time of day that they've been logged in. So you can see a lot of that data there. I know this other one is covering up. The one that you're seeing with the graphics on it is one that is delivered to a parent, a guardian, anybody that can be put into our system, that's showing time on task every day, particularly time on assessment and instruction. We see students kind of figure the system out and try to maybe game it at times, and that's really a big thing about this report, because it's probably not how they're successful. Students will pretty much figure out a digital curriculum and how to navigate it, and again, and legitimately, it's they're adapting to the course and solve the great things about it to accelerate learning, because we build that in of meeting students where they are within our content. So if they understand something, they can move on. But typically, those kids that don't, they'll spend a little bit more time on assessments. They may not be getting their work done. They may have overdue assignments, and this report that Stuart just launched up there is great, because it will go out weekly to anybody who has an email attached to that student. So those are big things to look at as far as the data, and then obviously we got other reporting that will inform teachers, other administrators, and full grade book so to speak, within our system that allows the teachers to control instruction and student progress through the content. So all good reports, you know, to take a look at. But again, we're justifying all time on task, and this is the one that you see there kind of behind is the one that mostly the charters are looking at, and delivering that to them on a timely basis is something that we're definitely able to do. So we're looking at an instructional model of any type of digital curriculum, you know, whether or not it's, you know, something that we have to curate or invent ourselves with whatever resources we have. It's always good to start off with a bell ringer anticipatory set. It's built right within our curriculum. Direct instruction, guided practice is critical to student success in a digital curriculum. Students sometimes don't see the value of that, and that's usually the part of teachers getting involved in facilitating that. So it's ground instruction, relevant real-world scenarios, application to deepen their conceptual understanding. That's one of the things I think that with Apex that we've kind of set ourselves apart from, because a lot of the content, you know, when we're talking primarily 6 through 12 is requiring a higher depth of knowledge, especially on any type of standardized assessment. So if they're not getting that opportunity to develop that, they're going to struggle. So within the curriculum that we have, it's definitely something that helps out, and teachers' ability to monitor progress, formative feedback, either within our system or just formative feedback to assessment as they're completing it. Supports and scaffolds, and we have a lot of that built in, as I talked about with special ed populations, just being able to activate prior knowledge and scaffolding their way through the course itself. And then good hefty assessments. There's a lot and flexibility with assessments, which Apex provides. Usually you'll get test banks with questions and with just various question types, not just multiple choice. So we can get those students prepared for high stakes exams and to be successful in college or the career of their choice.
Awesome. Thank you, Mike. This is
You're very
really
welcome.
helpful information for people. And a reminder as we go through this, people have been reaching out asking about assistance with setting up remote learning settings, and also with requests for how do they arrange financing. The contact information at the beginning and end of this presentation has that, but reach out to any of us and we'll direct you to the right person. I'm sure Mike is happy to help on all the remote learning stuff, and we at CSC are happy to help on the funding front. So with that, let's talk about staffing, board, authorizer support, just making sure your school is supported by some of the key parties that you really need to maintain your school through this situation. Tricia, can you lead us through this?
I can. Thanks, Stuart. You can go ahead and put next slide up. So both Mike and Stuart have really walked you through some very tactical pieces of how to run your school in these trying times and how to prepare for the future. I think my next few slides are certainly tactical in nature for some of it, but also some of it is the softer side of how to run a business, right? And so, does your staff have what they need to deliver your programs? Have you implemented your infectious disease outbreak plan? I expect most of us don't even have an infectious disease outbreak plan. So now is a great time to work with your staff to start putting something in place for an emergency shutdown in the future. And of course, most of the teachers and staff are probably working on ways to get through the next 60 or 90 days, and it's important to support as we're working through these challenges. I think on a softer side, teachers and staffs are going to need different needs and different immediate priorities. Just like what Mike said with students and remote learning, I think, you know, teachers, staff, and even school leadership community are all challenged on different days and different moments with, you know, the coronavirus crisis, but also friends and family and figuring out how to teach remotely if they've never taught remotely, how to manage their students. So it's important that we, you know, provide that support so that they can deliver their programs to the students effectively. I think in terms of tactics, it's really important in case teachers, staff, school leadership are stricken, in case they come up with the coronavirus, their parents, their children themselves, where they actually have to step away from teaching. Now is a really important time to have that succession plan. And that can be really simple, but it needs to really be public so that if the person has to step away, the next teacher or designated person can slide in so that there is somewhat of a seamless learning experience for students. And if you don't already have a notice protocol for how it's going to work, right? We all used to have the luxury of outside substitute teachers. I think some charter schools are still using that, but mostly there isn't probably a protocol or a process in place of how you notice the teachers and staff when they need to step up. So create that list so everyone can see who needs to do what, and then also how to actually communicate what needs to happen. Because communication right now, when we're all sheltering in place, is really, really important to get the job done. And then, like I said, providing support for teachers and staff, encourage staff to protect their personal health. I think, you know, that's an incredibly important piece of all of this. I think meeting people where they are, right? I mentioned this earlier, connecting with people. Some people are having good days, some are having bad, moment to moment, and connect formally and informally. I think some organizations are doing a really great job of creating new formal meetings that aren't necessarily all business, but are creating and promoting the camaraderie that typically occurs in an office setting. And then informally, I know I've been receiving some lovely texts in the morning and throughout the day. So if you can find the time to do that for your staff, your teachers, community, I think that's a really excellent way to keep morale up. Next slide, please, Stuart. So how to leverage your board in time of crisis. We just talked about how to actually support your staff. This is really how to work with your board. It is incredibly important and may not be on most of our purview at this point, right? Because we're just trying to get through teaching our children, maybe feeding our free and reduced lunch kids, figuring out how to care for our homeless population. But you really do need to continue to work with your board. And so how do you do that? We know you need to be as strategic as possible, right? And the first question I ask is, do we have important board business or deadlines between now and the end of the year, right? And can we adjust them or reprioritize them? I know in a traditional end of the year, we would be working on budgets for next fall, renewals for our insurances and our medical and health for our teachers. We would be working on hiring. So all of those things are still incredibly important and you need to be strategic about them, but how you do that likely will change from what you've done in the past. And along with that, don't make rash decisions that you'll regret later, right? It may feel counterintuitive, especially after I've listed off all of those things that you might be working with the board on, but take a breath and be cautious and document sort of why you're making decisions and keep that on record. And along with that, what, if any, difference do your state's open meeting laws allow or require schools to do? I know some states have said, don't even worry about board meetings. It's pretty hard to run a school when you're not working with your board. Do you know, do your local authorizer state or laws allow for virtual meetings? Some schools have that as part of their charter and their bylaws, others don't. So how do you make the transition to virtual meetings? And then can you hold meetings over the email and publish those meetings on the website? Those are questions that you can ask to figure out how to conduct your strategic business going forward. And again, like I said, check state and authorizer updates. If there are none, send an email so that it's in writing to your authorizer requesting guidance. How should the board be kept informed of school business when not usually involved? So again, typically the board flies at 30,000 feet. School leadership manages the day-to-day business and curriculum education at the school. And there is a monthly board meeting and or an update to the board president regularly. So again, the question becomes, who is responsible for keeping the board informed? How is that information communicated? And again, you need to ensure that emergency operation needs are addressed. So again, that succession plan that I've mentioned. And then that leads me to the next one, which is prepare now with emergency succession and contingency plans. Just like the teacher who's going to sub if someone gets sick, what if our CEO gets sick? For me, my question always is, what if my CFO gets sick? Who is the leadership that can step in and manage the day-to-day tactics of running the school, right? To make sure that checks are getting cut, to make sure that students are being educated, right? Those are incredibly important pieces. So again, we need to make sure that we have a succession plan published so that we know exactly how to step in. And then the same with our board. What happens if our board chair gets sick or some of your other active board members? How can we fill those pieces? If we still need to have quorum, we need to make sure that we're watching that and succession planning appropriately.
In your case,
slide.
Tricia, I think for years people have thought your CEO was sick.
That's true. That's true. How to work with your authorizer in crisis. I think this is tricky because a lot of us don't know how to work with our authorizer during times of good. It's not easy, authorizer charter school relationships. Some folks are lucky enough to have really great relationships with their authorizers, and so that leads into probably an easier time now. But it is tricky, and so the good or the bad of it all is that there's a lot of federal guidance and state guidance and governor's executive orders which are providing framework, right? And we're all trying to kind of guide our way through what everyone's saying and how to respond appropriately. Ideally, authorizers are providing additional framework and support for charter schools. I know some authorizers are doing a great job of that, you know, right down to providing free and reduced lunch meals for schools, charter schools and traditional district schools, right? So I know LAUSD has done an excellent job. I have a child in school there, and they've literally just taken all of the free and reduced lunch planning and dissemination of meals for charter schools and district schools, which is great because it takes one of the responsibilities off you as a charter school. You can focus your bandwidth elsewhere. And then, you know, I think this is one I'm less familiar with, but I think it would be great if, as we're moving towards a more remote learning or an online platform, if we can reach out to our authorizers, because again, some of them are already providing remote learning tools or online access, and in this time of need, there may be more willingness to share with charter schools so that we can make sure our students are effectively educated. On the flip side, authorizers are perfectly positioned to act as conduits of important information for their charter schools. So if there are any authorizers on the phone or on this webinar, this is a great time to lean in and be supportive of charter schools to enhance that relationship from the authorizer side. If you're not getting that, I recommend that you have clear, effective, and most importantly, and this is really what I'm saying, is documented communication to your authorizer as a charter school. So, you know, again, depending on the type of relationship you have and the type of bandwidth and support your authorizers providing. You can have formal and informal communication, but make sure all guidance questions, the how do you do this, what if this happens, is sent in an email. I want you to create a written record so that, you know, in the future, as things become more clear, you have the support you need if those become questions. And those types of things really are special ed, free and reduced lunch, homeless students, funding matters, attendance reporting. Those types of things are really crucial in these uncertain times. So
people
that wraps up. Go ahead.
So people know we're just past the top of the hour, and we just have a few more minutes, and the presentation is available afterwards for people to review, download, and share. So you should be able to hear it all. But I wanted to let you know there's just a few more minutes left. Please continue, Tricia.
Thanks, Stuart. Actually, that was perfect because I wrapped up my piece of the webinar today. So next slide, I think, brings you back.
Great.
Oh.
Well, as you go through things, I think some of the things, Tricia, did you want to touch on these, or you want me to walk through these?
I'm happy to talk to them through them.
Why don't you do this, and then I'll take the next one.
Okay, great. So ask yourselves, these are the kind of overarching guiding questions that you as a school leader, a board member can ask is, are we in constant communication with our authorizer? How are our special ed students being served? How are we serving the houseless or homeless population? How are we handling free and reduced lunch? And then also, I think really it's important to think about auditing, testing, and academic performance. Some state guidelines and some authorizers have already addressed testing and school minutes and school days, but others have not. So ask yourself those questions and go get the information you need. Next slide.
So as mentioned at the beginning and the outset and throughout, that at Charter School Capital, because we're funding schools nationwide, we've been tracking legal changes, announcements, gubernatorial and legislative modifications that have been made to address this public school crisis. And one thing I think people may not fully understand, as we're focused on the news here in the US or even more locally, particularly as charter leaders, this past week, we've been tracking out of school student populations. And 2 weeks ago, there were already 500 million kids worldwide out of schools. As of this past week, that number has risen to nearly 1.5 billion, with today 87% of school children out of school or not location-based in terms of learning. So there's obviously a huge near-term shock to the system worldwide. As a result, if you think about all the resources around, they're really going to be tested as they are with this global crisis. And so you can contact us if you'd like, but here are some of the links, and in the material there are links to information. We have this for all states available at Charter School Capital, where you can see what the emergency changes have been to school funding, school requirements, attendance, and things like that that Tricia just mentioned. So you can see what's happening near term. And as mentioned, I think in the near term for this fiscal year, while things are not situation normal from a funding standpoint, they look like for the most part they will be, but all of those things Tricia suggested about tracking your performance and doing things in writing is important, since it may be in some states you're required to prove that you tried or prove that you actually delivered something in some way, and it varies for each locale. Other resources that are available right now that we've touched on, the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools has a page up right now, a link on their website for COVID-19 resources. You've heard here from Mike regarding Apex Learning's programs. There are others around the country delivering this, and you see some of them listed here. And for things beyond remote learning and remote access, the California Department of Education also has some information regarding online internet plans. And as we said, our blog at the Charter School Capital website has updates to links for information that you can access. Finally, I just want to thank everybody for joining us today, and particularly to my co-hosts, Mike Goodyear and Tricia Blum. I think the information here is really helpful. The expertise is obvious, and I think as school leaders around the country, as you think about what you're doing, I think do the right thing that feels right for you, regardless of what's going on around you. Support your kids, your teachers, your staff, the families and community as best you can, and try not to take this crisis too hard as you go through. Everybody is constrained. Everybody is dealing with unexpected situations, and all of us just do the best we can. There are a lot of people out there trying to help, and there are a lot of changes now and more coming in the future. Anything you can do to proactively create stability for your school, whether it's maintaining relationships with your board or your authorizer, tracking state laws, building financing options for yourself, or accessing cash through financing, and ensuring that you have close relationships with your most trusted vendors is important. Track everything you do as you're going through this time, as people may be asking you, hey, show me what you did. And again, just know you're doing the best that you can during this situation. I think whatever happens in the future, everybody will have faced this crisis together, and will understand, I think, that we all did the best we could. So with that, contact information is here for the experts that were on today. Feel free to reach out to any of us. And thank you again for joining us today. It's been a pleasure having you with us, and we're really excited about the response we got to today's webinar. Thanks again. Mike or Tricia,
everyone.
anything to add?
Just want to say thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Mike.